So Truman is next on the list, and it's funny because I feel like Truman kind of gets stuck in the shadow of some of these other progressive presidents who did not like the Constitution very much. I learned a lot, probably more than any other president I learned about Truman that I didn't know.
Yeah, Truman's an interesting case. You're right, because he's kind of forgotten. But what happened after World War II is very interesting because we had all this stuff that go on during the war. The economy is being centralized, and you've got all these government boards and all these government agencies created. Well, Truman, ingeniously just said, okay, we're not going to take these away. We're just going to rename them something else, and we're going to keep it. So what we have now is basically the same government structure we had during World War II in 2016, and Truman is responsible for that. He unilaterally declared the war over. Congress didn't do it. He just said, yeah, okay, I say the war's over now. This is crazy. And then, of course, you have the ramping up of the Cold War. And one of the things I found interesting about Truman, the way he sold the Cold War, particularly the Korean War, was that we were going to have North Korean bombers flying overhead in 1950. Now, I think the North Koreans didn't even develop aircraft until probably 1980. So this is crazy. But he was selling it as an emergency and give up your liberties, pay more taxes, do what you got to do. And I'm going to unilaterally deal with this Cold War situation. And my gosh, again, Korean War. There's no declared war there. But he just did it anyway. So when you look at the 20th century and how important Truman is and this idea of undeclared wars, keeping government bureaucracy in place, he had his own, his fair deal instead of the square deal, the New Deal. Very creative. He's got the fair deal, and of course he's pushing for national health care, all kinds of things that we eventually get. He basically took Roosevelt's second Bill of Rights and said, these are going to be my talking points, and I'm going for it. And now we've got all of that here in 2016.
It's like everywhere we look, someone's making us a deal we can't refuse.
That's right.
It's like Godfather. So LBJ and Nixon are next. Obviously, I felt like I was pretty up to snuff on these two, but still some interesting insights about how far off the rails they continue to take us.
Well, sure. LBJ, if you're any student of the Great Society, it's all unconstitutional. The way that he sold this, again, it was, we need to do these things because these are things that are beneficial for the American public. Who cares about the Constitution? And then, of course, you've got the Vietnam War, which was another undeclared war. We have to remember LBJ cut his teeth in the Roosevelt administration. He was an old Roosevelt ally, and this is a guy that believed in the New Deal. He believed in expansive government. He grew up very poor in Texas, so he thought that the general government should come in and control education, control the environment, whatever it was. We're going to have a federal program to go do these things, whether it's constitutional or not. Who cares? And I'm going to act. LBJ was very famous for his treatment, they called it, where he'd get in your face and he'd laugh or cry or yell. But he was going to get his way. This was executive government to the T. And so there's no doubt about it. LBJ was a person who was dramatically increasing the power of the federal government in the 1960s and early 70s.
Yeah, and I look at LBJ as the guy who he wasn't. Barack Obama gets a lot of credit for being the guy that nobody would want to have a beer summit with, but I think LBJ should have that honor because that would.
Oh yeah, he is. Well, if you ever listen to the tapes, there's some tapes between Nixon and LBJ after LBJ is out of office and Nixon's in, and they're having a conversation. He sounds like a very nice guy. Of course, the untold story of LBJ, they called him Landslide Lyndon because he was buying votes in Texas to get in. In one particular case, he was up against Coke Stevenson. And, in early another campaign, this is when he's got the name for it because lo and behold, LBJ lost, but they recount in one little area that LBJ had a lot of influence in. It comes back, oh, we forgot about these votes. And here you go, Lyndon, you're in. And so this is why he had that moniker, Landslide Lyndon. And, he was a philanderer. The guy cheated on his wife constantly. You look at LBJ and you think, how is that possible? But he was. This is, it's the side note of LBJ, but the guy was a really horrible guy.
Yeah, men and women are both attracted to power. There's no exclusiveness there.
Right.
So Nixon is interesting because Nixon gets so much of the froth and anger and contempt of certain progressives. He's one of the few Republicans in the modern era that's on the list. I know you mentioned the Bushes, you mentioned Clinton, you got a nod to some certain guys, but Nixon's the one who kind of really stokes their ire. Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, Nixon is funny because during his entire administration, his chief of staff, Haldeman, kept saying, you know what, I don't know why the left is attacking us. We're doing all the things they want. We're giving them environmental legislation. We're giving them affirmative action. We're giving them whatever it is they want. We're giving it to them. And they couldn't understand why the left just kept attacking him because it's not their guy. And so that was why. But yeah, Nixon is often regarded as this conservative. And if you get in a debate with Pat Buchanan on this, he's gonna go toe to toe with you and say Nixon was a really good president.
I hope to. Someday.
Well, I mean, but he's not. And so I like Pat, but of course Pat was in his administration. So the fact is, when you look at some of the things Nixon did, whether it's coming off the gold standard, now he had to come off a precious metal standard because we had spent so much money during the Great Society, and the Congress gave us, this baseline budgeting bill eventually, where we couldn't cut spending, we could only grow it. But so he had to come off of the precious metal standard, which wrecked the economy. You look at all the spending; it increased
the
dramatically.
value of the dollar only went down like 55% in a decade. I mean,
come on, it's not nothing to be. No, I mean that's it. You're right. I mean, come on, it's not 100.
Half.
Right, it's not 100%.
Yeah.
It's 55.
Yeah.
So, but when you look at all the things Nixon did in office, and of course you got Watergate, which I take him to task for that, and trying to shield the executive branch from any kind of congressional oversight. And I use Sam Ervin, who's a great forgotten senator. People don't like Sam Ervin on one hand because, of course, he's against the Civil Rights Bill, but he really is strong on the Constitution and civil liberties. And you got to say this guy was right at times about that stuff. And so, it's amazing. You can't say this guy because of this he's terrible. You got to look at their entire picture and say this guy was right about this issue, and so we should pay attention to what he's saying. And Nixon was just really a disaster when it comes to executive power. There's no doubt about it.
I feel like I want to ask you, when you're talking about Washington, Alexander Hamilton, to me, was he just a dapper chap who could really cut a rug? Like, why did Washington defer to him so much? Did he see
Hamilton? Look, Hamilton, as much as I don't like what Hamilton stood for, I really admire Hamilton for certain things. Number one, he was a brilliant guy. I mean, this guy was a workhorse. And, if you asked him, look, Hamilton, I need you to sit down and tell me if this bill is constitutional. Okay. He would write you 7,500 words, whereas Jefferson would give you maybe 1,000. So, I mean, this guy was a workhorse, and he was brilliant. At 17, he's writing pamphlets and making speeches that 35, 40-year-olds were impressed by. He was just a really brilliant guy. And of course, he's ambitious, and he wanted the general government to have a tremendous amount of power. Part of that's because he never really was attached to a state. Hamilton was not born in the original 13 colonies. He was born in Barbados. And so he comes over to the United States, what became the United States, and he really doesn't attach to New York. He's from New York, but he's really not. Of course, his wife is from a very old family there. But he's not like Washington, where Washington is Virginia to the bone. Thomas Jefferson called Virginia his country. And so he's not one of those guys. He's not a Pennsylvanian. He's not a Massachusetts. He's not somebody that says, this is who I belong to. He belonged to the nation, as he called it, and that's what he wanted. And of course, he was, I think, in many ways, a closet monarchist. He loved the British Constitution, and he had a silver tongue. I think he could get Washington trusted him. Washington relied on him during the war, and I think that Washington just believed in everything he had to say eventually. So,
and that's the part
Hamilton
of
had a lot of
obviously
power.
You had a lot of truth to back up your assertion. I just look at him as a guy who you just want to put your stock in him, right? And I look at Nixon and say, this is the mistake he made. He cared way too much what people thought that he really shouldn't have even considered whatsoever.
Exactly. I mean, I think you're right. Nixon was concerned about polls, and he barely lost in 1960. He probably won. If there wasn't some voter fraud. And if he had challenged 1960, he probably won. He barely won in 1968. So he was going into 72, and he doesn't want to lose that. He wants to win in a landslide, and he did. I mean, you look at the 1972 election, there's no way if they were actually going out, it depends on what conspiracy theories you believe in, but if they were actually going out to dig up dirt on his opponents at Watergate Hotel, it was a worthless enterprise because Nixon was going to win. He had done what he said he was going to do, and that's get the troops out of Vietnam for the most part. And so, it's amazing how, this guy cared so much about polling, and it did him in. And what people thought, he should have just come clean and said, yeah, these guys broke in the hotel. I had nothing to do with it. Go put him in jail. But he didn't. He tried to cover it up because he thought this was going to be a disaster politically.
No, knowing what we know now, he should have just said he had pneumonia, and everyone was like, "Oh, okay." Cool.
Yeah, right. I just had pneumonia.
I'm good.
No big deal. Carry on. Look the other way. I'll be fine.
Yeah. Next. So the last one on the list is Obama, and like I said, you give kind of a hat tip to the presidents in between he and Nixon. But the thing about Obama, as I look back at him and LBJ and Woodrow and Theodore R squared, all of them you mentioned have this kind of thinly veiled or outright contempt for the Constitution. They talk about it, they write about it. As I look at the contempt of Constitution cake, the top layer has Obama standing by himself without a bride, just him at the top saying, look, it's a charter of negative liberties, a couple other choice lines in there about how it just wasn't getting the job done. And I think every time a president says this, it's unfortunate the populace goes, you know what? He's right. The Constitution's an outdated document. It's organic. It needs adjustments. It needs to be fixed.
Right. Well, I mean, you're right. I mean, and I have a response to that. Well, then amend the Constitution. If you don't like it, then amend it, but don't just violate it. And there's actually an interesting book by a guy named Terry Moe, and it's entitled Relic. And his basic position is that what we need to do, and my last podcast was on this, what we need to do is go out and give the president legislative authority to propose, not just propose legislation, but write legislation. Well, my point is he already does that. I mean, what's new? So there's really nothing to see there. But the idea is that we need stronger executive power because that would solve problems. And basically, that's what Obama does. He just does it, and then Congress can get in line or they can take him to court, whatever it is. But he's going to do it. And, who cares? Now, of course, he always shields that by saying, well, I was a constitutional lawyer. I taught the Constitution. Well, so what? You didn't teach it well, I guess, because you obviously don't care about it. And the point I make in that last chapter is that, look, for the last 4 administrations, we've had this slide into an elective monarch. And I think all of them are responsible for it in one way or another. But Obama has shown the most contempt out of the last 4, whether it's George H.W. Bush, Clinton, George W. Bush. Obama just doesn't care if it's constitutional or not. He's just going to do it. And, he does say, well, I can't do that. But I think at the end of the day, he's perfectly fine with giving executive orders or acting unilaterally when he has to get the job done in whatever job that may be in that he supports.
Hell yeah! Hell yeah! Hell yeah! Hell yeah! Hell yeah! But I'm a big fan of money. I like it. I use it. I have a little. I keep it in a jar on top of my refrigerator. I'd like to put more in that jar. That's where you come in.